I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, running the game under HDR. The monitor does indeed support HDR. It responds to two HDR formats. You've got HDR10 support and Dolby Vision support. I will be covering mainly HDR10. Dolby Vision is not supported to the same extent as HDR10, but I will be covering both a little bit. The monitor has VESA DisplayHDR TrueBlack 400 certification, so that's an OLED standard, not to be confused with VESA DisplayHDR 400 without the TrueBlack. The monitor also does support higher bursts of brightness if you're using an alternative HDR mode. So under HDR, as I explored in the best settings video, it's really HDR Peak 1000 that most people are going to be interested in. That will give you the full brightness capabilities. Dolby Vision, I would recommend leaving that off unless you're specifically looking at Dolby Vision content. Again, I will explore this shortly. But you can see there are various other smart HDR settings. And again, I explore these a bit more in the best settings video. You may also like the DisplayHDR TrueBlack setting if you prefer a more toned down look to things with lower brightness levels, but you still want to enjoy the other attributes of HDR. So speaking of brightness, because this is an OLED, and again the contrast measurements will be 0 black level and an infinite contrast recorded, there's no need to focus on anything other than brightness, so I'm just going to jump straight into the graphs here. This graph here shows an HDR brightness test with various different patch sizes. There's 1%, 4%, 9%, 25%, 49% and 100%. So there's a white patch in the middle of the screen, and the test runs in HDR, the monitor's in HDR, and the rest of the screen is pure black. And of course, for the 100% reading, the entire screen is white, there's no black visible, and that's a sustained reading taken after 30 seconds of the shade being displayed, whereas for the other patch sizes, they are what I call true peak readings, so the highest level that the monitor attains when that patch is being displayed on the screen. So the orange line there shows the Dell Alienware AW3225QF, so the first generation QD-OLED, but this is a very typical QD-OLED performance, so it's good to benchmark against, so to speak. The purple line here is with the HDR Peak 1000 setting on this monitor, the AW3225QF. You'll see it's actually really quite close to the orange line. It's actually a little bit dimmer, my sample was at least, but there can be some inter-unit variation and it's really nothing to stress about. The difference here is slight, and to be honest, if I hadn't measured it, I wouldn't have even known there was a difference. So to the eye, it's not something which you're going to readily pick up on. The grey line there, that is using the DisplayHDR TrueBlack setting. So you can see it's a lot more consistent there, but it reaches a lower brightness. So the typical QD-OLED performance parameters under HDR apply, so there is ABL, automatic brightness limiter behavior, so it reaches its peak with the 1% window in this test. So basically it can show really nice brightness for small highlights, but as bright shades dominate, or in this test as the white patch becomes larger, then the brightness capability is diminished. The brightness that can be attained, I should say, is diminished. So there's quite a drop off by the 9% patch size. So the luminance is roughly half of what it is at peak for smaller patch sizes. Then it drops further to 364, then 312, and then it drops down to 251 nits for 100% sustained. This graph is a little bit different. So the TrueBlack reading has gone bye-bye, and instead I've replaced it with another line which shows the Dolby Vision bright setting. But this is an HDR10 test, it's not a Dolby Vision test, so this isn't a true reflection of what you can expect with Dolby Vision itself. It is a little bit brighter than with the HDR Peak 1000 setting, but really only a little bit. I just wanted to include it here just for completeness, really, just to show you that you can get a little bit of extra brightness, but this tells you nothing about the calibration of the display and what you can actually expect in practice, which I will cover subjectively very shortly. So back to the game and what this all means. Well, you've got the per pixel illumination still, so the dark elements there are really nice and dark, so the little shadowy details in the rock cracks there, very dark indeed. The medium to dark shades very slightly brighter, and the bright to medium shades brighter again. So basically you've got an exceptional array of different brightness levels with per pixel illumination showing this all appropriately. You've also got 10-bit color reproduction, which helps improve the nuanced shade variety. It can also help smooth out gradients, but that doesn't apply in this particular scene, but it does for the brighter shades, which I'll show you a bit later. It allows gentler gradients, smoother shade progressions, and just a more natural look to things. But in this scene, it really does allow the monitor to display the little shadowy details with beautiful depth. The medium shades are shown with really nice depth as well. They don't look flooded or washed out as they typically would on LCDs. And at the same time, the bright shades here are shown with very nice eye-catching brightness. So yes, the dimming precision here is exceptional. It's basically like having 8.3 million dimming zones or so. So absolutely fantastic in that respect. I'm now going to dive into the water and consider some brighter shades. I like this scene for showing HDR off on monitors and just testing it. It's a scene I'm extremely familiar with, so I do like to use it. But the darker shades there shown very nicely. Again, the variety of medium and darker shades, very impressive. The burst of light up there, really nice smooth gradients as well, and a nice sort of natural look to the brightness. The glint of light on the water surface as well, very eye-catching indeed. I actually measured 1010 nits maximum for this particular element, so that's very impressive indeed. It's basically the maximum the monitor can output. Although I also recorded a minimum of 720 nits, and what I mean by that is you'll see it pulses to various different sizes. When it pulses to become particularly large, the ABL actually kicks in a little bit, which is why it was down to perhaps 720 minimum. But most of the time, it's closer to the maximum than it is to the minimum. And either way, it's eye-catching and it's bright. And also, unlike WOLEDs, which use a white pixel to show their brightness, and that's used very heavily under HDR, remember that this has RGB subpixels, so you don't have unfiltered white light coming from the monitor, and that allows it to not only output strong brightness, but also output good saturation at the same time. You might think that doesn't really matter for this kind of element because it's just white, what does it matter? But it has a bit of a rim of orange and then orangey red, and on WOLEDs there's just a very strong white core, and then there's sort of more saturated orange and red rings without any brightness to them whatsoever, and it just looks like a weird posterization effect. Whereas on this QD-OLED, you get quite a nice white core, but then it has a nice warm white around it, and then yellow, and then orange. It's all smoothly blended together because you get the saturation and brightness at the same time. In other words, the colour volume is much better. TFT Central has a very interesting article on this if you're interested, by the way, all about colour volume on OLED monitors, but it is something I've picked up on and mentioned in my reviews in the past, just subjectively. So remember that when I'm talking about brightness, in this case, the monitor can show good saturation at the same time. I'm on another scene on Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I wasn't even intending to go on this scene. I loaded the wrong thing, but I use this in the contrast section, so I'll just briefly talk about it. You can't appreciate this in the video, but there are some really nice, subtle, very dark details, these little skulls and bones for these sort of outer areas here. And the monitor displays that very well, so there's a really beautiful nuanced shade variety, and the depth of the dark shades is exceptional, actually much better than it was under SDR, but that can depend on the content rather than just being an SDR versus HDR thing. But either way, the 10-bit color reproduction and the per pixel illumination really does show this scene in a beautiful way, which unfortunately you can't appreciate in the video. And at the same time, really nice brightness in the center there. And there's no haloing or anything like that, so there's an immediate transition between the brightness there and the dark shadowy area on Lara's shoulder there. Immediate transition, no haloing or blooming as you would get with mini LED solutions. This scene is one which is often shown particularly well on OLEDs, but especially QD-OLEDs. And the reason I say especially QD-OLEDs is again because of the color volume issue I was talking about before with WOLEDs. And that's because this is not just pure white again, it's actually has a sort of silvery white rim around it, sort of a bluish silvery purple. And the QD-OLED is able to show that with a nice natural bright quality, and it's all nicely blended together rather than just having a pure white core and then more saturated but very dim kind of outer component. So it all looks much more natural on the QD-OLEDs like that, shown very nicely, and the brightness levels are really nice here. It's able to pump out nice luminance levels. I can't tell you exactly what they are because this is extremely difficult to measure with a colorimeter. I mean, I did seem to get some very brief flashes of what appeared to be quite close to the peak of the monitor, a little bit below that, but again, it's very difficult to accurately measure because it's smaller than the colorimeter sensor area, and also it's shifting around all over the place and shimmering, but very nicely displayed anyway. And again, the medium to dark shades, beautiful variety there, really nice shadow detail. This is shown in a much more impressive way than I would see on mini LED solutions, for example. So the overall scene shown very nicely here indeed. This scene here is one that mini LEDs will struggle with a bit because there are some very small bright elements, like the little bulbs to my left there and in the background, surrounded by much darker shades. So the level of precision you get with mini LEDs, certainly the ones I've tested, it's just not where it needs to be to show these properly. There'll also be sort of flickering or shifts with mini LED solutions, especially for the bulbs towards the top left there. They'll show sort of halos around the embers as well as they fall down to the sky because of the lack of precision. But with the per pixel illumination, you have no such issues here. And also being QD-OLED, the blue lights in the background there are shown with nice saturation as well as nice brightness. So it's really able to show these little bright elements in a really nice way. And it's able to keep the much darker shades as they should be, much darker at the same time. I'm just on Cyberpunk 2077, just taking a quick visit to this so I could talk a little bit more about the ABL, automatic brightness limiter behavior, because you'll recall from the graph that that was certainly an issue as brighter shades dominate. When you're looking at the scene now, or when I look at the scene now, most of the shades on the screen are sort of dark to medium, a few interspersed brighter elements, and QD-OLEDs like this, yes, they're able to show them nicely, and the HUD elements there are appropriately bright really. But if I move the scene so that there is more sky visible, the ABL kicks in more heavily. You'll probably be able to see a shift with the HUD elements, because the ABL doesn't just mean that it's limiting the brightness of the bright shades, it means that it's dragging down the brightness of the entire scene, so that includes the medium shades as well. So you can probably see the shift in the HUD. That's not just the camera playing tricks, that is actually something I can observe to the eye as well, and that is the ABL kicking in or reducing, kicking in, reducing, just based on the sort of average picture level of the scene. And also here, if I look at the sun towards the top, really nice and bright, whereas here it doesn't have such brightness. So it's not exactly dim, but it just doesn't have the same kind of eye-catching pop that it has when it's shown like that. So I just wanted to use this scene to explain that when I was sort of, well, not criticising mini LEDs, but saying that OLED certainly is superior to them in the other scenes I showed you, well, there are scenes like this where mini LED solutions can actually do better because of their ability to maintain strong brightness here rather than just here. I'm on another scene, this one on Battlefield 5, and I like this scene because on mini LED solutions, they can really shine, quite literally, whereas on OLEDs like this, the ABL again kicks in and limits the capabilities. So the bright sun there, I recorded that at around 350 nits. It does depend on what the scene's doing though, it goes a bit brighter sometimes it's even a bit dimmer, it just depends on how much bright shade is visible on the screen at once. But the main makeup of this scene most of the time, it's really a mixture of bright and dark shades, but there are sufficient amount of bright shade on the screen to cause the ABL to kick in fairly aggressively. So the silver lining around the cloud is a bit subdued and the sky in general isn't as bright as it should be. The glint of light on the ice there as well, not as eye-catching as it should be, and just the sun, it's not as bright as it should be. So it just doesn't have the kind of natural bright daylight quality that it could have. It doesn't look dim and it doesn't look flooded either, like some monitors would show under HDR. It's just more limited than it could be. And I'm going to shift attention to Dolby Vision. The vast majority of content you consume, especially for games, is HDR10. And HDR10 is pretty much always a supported format. For such content, Dolby Vision should be left off on the monitor. Otherwise it can upset the image balance and display things inaccurately. When observing HDR10 content, as I am now, this game is only HDR10 and I'm running in HDR10, you can activate Dolby Vision. That is to say, you can activate the setting in the monitor. It doesn't actually use Dolby Vision. It's just another sort of HDR preset really, or a set of presets. You'll see it says in the corner there, Dolby Vision, but I can assure you it isn't because this game does not support Dolby Vision. So I'm using the dark setting at the moment. Really, it's more in line with the HDR settings other than HDR Peak 1000 that I was using before. And it appears limited to a similar brightness of around 450 nits. I find it a bit limited in terms of the brightness for some scenes, and it didn't have the sort of pop I personally like from an HDR experience. Though it's relatively consistent due to the low ABL behaviour, just like with the TrueBlack 400 setting. Bright, well, that is indeed brighter. And game, well, game seems exactly the same as bright. These are sort of more akin to the HDR Peak 1000 setting, but the calibration is far wonkier. Now remember, I'm talking about HDR10 content here, I'm not talking about Dolby Vision content, just for HDR10 content. So many medium and some darker shades are over-brightened, and the overall appearance is flatter and less varied than it should be. Some bright elements are also dimmer than intended. For example, this street lamp that sits around 530 nits, whereas using HDR Peak 1000 it sits closer to 900 nits. It also appears as a giant white ball, just like it appears in the video, without the actual bulb visible. If you use HDR calibration in the game or in Windows, it will show that a 10% window is calibrated to around 500 nits. And with that, the bulb is visible, not as distinct as it was before, but it's more visible, so the sort of crushing of the bright shades is reduced. But even then, there's some noticeable over-brightening of shades, even here, and just more generally. So the shed here is a good example of this, actually. Some shades here are actually about twice as bright as they should be. Whichever way you look at it, the PQ curve is just off when you're using the Dolby Vision setting, but you're actually viewing HDR10 content. It is very difficult to show you this in the video, I'm afraid, but by eye it is very clear. This all looks elevated and flooded, which it certainly shouldn't, and it doesn't under HDR10. Actual Dolby Vision content, it is a different story. So to use Dolby Vision on Windows, you'll need the Dolby Vision app, which is a free download. There's a Microsoft App Store link where you can download it in the description of the video. I couldn't actually find this when I was searching the App Store for Dolby Vision. And after clicking the link to download it, so that's this download link here, I somehow had this maximized. I don't even know how you do it. It doesn't seem to do it anymore. But anyway, this was maximized and I couldn't see any link to download it, so I was a bit confused. But if you make sure you keep this window small, which is the default position, so there's this little thing here, there should be a little download button. I think it just says get or something like that here. So you just click that, you can get this Dolby Vision extensions plugin, and it'll just run in the background. It will basically allow you to run Dolby Vision content, and the monitor can use its Dolby Vision mode properly. So what Dolby Vision does, it allows dynamic metadata to be used with suitable adjustments made for very specific scenes or frames of the content. So this contrasts with HDR10, which uses static metadata or more general adjustments, which just apply to the game as a whole, for example. Additionally, 12-bit color processing can be used to help the monitor use that metadata more precisely, so a bit of a bump from 10 bits. The format itself is quite strict with its requirements, including at least 99% DCI-P3 coverage, a 1000 nit plus peak brightness, and contrast ratio of at least 200,000 to 1. So this monitor does actually satisfy all of those requirements. The enhanced precision of this format allows game developers to bring specific scenes and elements in the content to life in a more tailored way, and it can potentially improve aspects such as shadow detail, bright shade distinctions, and gradient handling. This all seems very good on paper, of course, but it's up to the developer to implement it well, and it's only supported at all in a small minority of PC game titles at the moment. With those titles also supporting HDR10 as an alternative format which all HDR monitors support. It's more widely supported on movie content, including using the Netflix app on the PC, where I observed some content using the setting. As with games, some movie content will have a better Dolby Vision implementation than others. For copyright reasons, I'm afraid I'm not going to be showing you the actual content, though the differences between HDR10 and Dolby Vision would be very difficult to see in the video anyway. I still want to share some brief impressions I had using Dolby Vision though. I didn't notice any difference between the bright, dark or game settings, unlike when I was observing HDR10, where the dark and the bright or game settings were very different, or at least the dark setting was different to bright/game. And I settled with bright anyway, because I like the name, and in case it did make a difference it would be presumably the brightest setting. But the difference didn't seem dramatic compared to HDR10 anyway, But it did seem to be more contrasty in some scenes, with some very impressive dark to medium shade distinctions, and certain bright elements appearing to pop more than under HDR10. So why am I showing you the Night Agent website? Well, it's just because I thought that this title showcased Dolby Vision pretty well, and I certainly did think it enhanced the experience compared to HDR10. So it's a Sony Pictures production, and as the name implies, there are certainly some good night scenes in it, and that allows the screen to pump out its brightness without excessive hindrance from its ABL. There was a certain scene set in the night where there was a search ongoing, and there were lots of small flashing lights from emergency vehicles, and there was also a helicopter with a searchlight. And all of these lights had noticeably more pop under Dolby Vision than HDR10, and actually it appeared more like you might expect such elements to appear in a game. So that helicopter searchlight I was talking about, well, under HDR10 I recorded that at 350 nits, whereas with Dolby Vision I recorded it at 590 nits. So not quite twice as bright, but significantly brighter, and I did notice this by eye before I took any measurements. So yeah, I mean, the same sort of observations, they were made in various other scenes and indeed other titles, and I can't recall the name of the title, but there was a certain restaurant scene in another title where the candles were simply brighter under Dolby Vision, and at the same time there were subtle dark distinctions that were just more impressive. So the whole scene just looked a bit more natural, really, and more believable. I mean, it's difficult to assess gradients as they're already at a smooth level under HDR10 anyway, and streamed content isn't exactly the best way of assessing this, as it is compressed rather heavily. So really I consider Dolby Vision a nice bonus, particularly for movies where the brightness peaks can be used more appropriately. Outside of that, the differences are probably going to be more nuanced, but either way, it's a nice option to have, and hopefully support for the format will also expand in the PC gaming space, and perhaps as more monitors support it, that will happen. So back to some gameplay now. I'm using the HDR Peak 1000 setting, by the way, running the game with HDR10, and I'm going to talk about the colour reproduction because that's another important aspect of HDR. So if you recall this monitor's colour gamut, which is 99% DCI-P3, and there's some extension beyond that, so decent encroachment towards Rec 2020. So under HDR, unlike under SDR, the game developers can target wider colour spaces such as DCI-P3 and ultimately Rec 2020. So this one doesn't fully cover Rec 2020, but as I mentioned, decent encroachment onto that space. So there's a good level of vibrancy overall. Some of the greens here appear with nice pop, and so does the sky, but the wide gamuts can be targeted more appropriately now. So that means you don't get the kind of oversaturation you get where you're basically having an sRGB target but a massively expanded colour gamut which isn't neatly used. Instead, you're having appropriate use of the colour spaces supported by the monitor. You just get more selective saturation where the developers might want it to be. The flowers here are also nice and eye-catching, the blue flowers. So yes, there are plenty of lush and vibrant and eye-catching shades, but things that should be more toned down are more toned down. That includes Laura's skin as well. Under SDR, that appears with too much of a red push, and some of the brickwork there as well, it appears reddish orange, and some of it can appear a bit of a reddish brown or an orangey brown, whereas here it appears more neutral and more as it should look. I did also mention the colour volume before, so unlike WOLEDs, you don't have dilution because of an unfiltered white subpixel. So it's not really such a factor in this scene. I mean, to some extent with the fire here because it's bright and there are some nice bright oranges, but there are some scenes in this game with flowing lava and that kind of thing where you can see the gamut put to good use but also the brightness at the same time. So that's nice to see, and really the overall representation is good in the colour department because it doesn't look overdone in terms of saturation and it looks very far from washed out. So they've put the gamut to good use and the colour capabilities of the monitor to good use. So overall, I did like the HDR experience on this. I found that it was quite similar really to my AW3423DW, which is a very nicely calibrated under HDR, and the panel capabilities are similar. So you would expect it to be similar, but I'm glad to see that Dell didn't mess anything up with the calibration, which could have upset the image. And you've got the Dolby Vision support as well, which the older model didn't have.